Welcome to Enemy of the Surveillance State, where we discuss news, tips, and open source tools to help you protect your privacy in an age of mass digital surveillance. I am your host, C. Mitchell Shaw, and joining me today is my special guest, Murray Hunter, also known as Grown-Up Number 474D8B50, author of the book Boris the BabyBot, a little book about big data. We're going to discuss surveillance, children, and the whole idea of surveillance capitalism this week on Enemy of the Surveillance State. Well, welcome to the show, Murray. I'm really stoked to have you here today. So you're from South Africa.
Yeah, I'm speaking to you from Cape Town, from the back room in my house. And it's kind of funny because this would have seemed like a really long distance conversation. But at this point, this is the same way I speak to someone who lives, half a kilometer away from my house.
Exactly. Welcome to the new normal, they keep calling it. I want my old normal back, but whatever. So what's the weather like in Cape Town today?
It is getting to be our winter because we're different hemisphere. So it's getting cold, which is why I'm in a hoodie. In fact, I'm in an InfoSec hoodie. This is from Thinkst, a local digital security firm, which has developed this really cool thing called canary tokens, which is a way for you to upload like a kind of booby-trapped file onto your server. So if anyone opens it and downloads it, it pings you.
Nice.
Anyway, sorry, that was why I'm wearing warm clothes because it is cold in Cape Town. And
I just turned off my air conditioner to record this. So how about that? So your book, and I came across this. This was actually, there was a guy that supports me on Patreon. He supports the show on Patreon, and I really appreciate it. So he reached out to me to say, hey, there's this guy that's written this children's book. I helped fund that because you crowdfunded the book, correct?
That's correct, yep. So
a supporter that we have in common, thank God to the internet. I love the whole idea of the community of the internet because I would have never, I might have stumbled across you on Twitter or something, and then I might not have, but this guy just reaches out to me. He's like, hey, Mitch, you really probably ought to see if you can interview him. And
sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead.
Well, we're going to be speaking a lot about the perils of the internet, right? And I think that's maybe what you were hinting at is we're going to be talking about all the things that make this a dreadful and scary place. But certainly my book wouldn't have ever existed if the internet wasn't there. I mean, it was funded through this crowdfunding campaign that people contributed. About 250 folks from across the world contributed. We've got a bunch of people from the States, from Europe, from Japan, from New Zealand. And that was for me my first personal experience with this thing called the crowd, where just a bunch of beautiful strangers like reach out and say, let's all make this thing together.
Yeah, it would be super easy, when you just stare into the abyss of surveillance and for instance, so most of my show is about what I call the surveillance state proper. This episode is going to be a little different because we're going to be talking about what I like to call the incestuous relationship between the surveillance state proper and these surveillance companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, etc., that all make their money by harvesting people's data. So this will be a little different because we're not going to be talking about the NSA, the CIA, GCHQ, or any of those surveillance state entities, but instead talking about the idea of surveillance capitalism. And it's really easy if you just stare into the abyss of that to be like, oh, to heck with this. I'm done. I'm getting rid of my smartphone. I'm throwing my laptop in the trash, and I'm just going to go live on an island somewhere, be a Luddite and avoid technology for the rest of my life. But hey, man, I love the internet. Like, seriously, I've got an EFF sticker on my laptop that says it says EFF, like IF, but it's got the heart symbol because it's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF. I heart the internet because I do. I just think the internet is, it's like any other community. You've got good parts of town and bad parts of town. You've got good people and bad people. And So today we're going to talk a little bit about sort of how we introduced these ideas to kids. And Murray, your book, I think, is a great way to do that, because before the show, you and I were discussing like sort of my idea that our generation are the first generation of real internet parents. So in Ed Snowden's book, Permanent Record, he talks about, kind of being raised on the internet. But even still, his baby pictures existed in a book, an actual photo album, right? And he says in his book that ours is the first generation of kids. The kids that are coming up right now are going to be the first generation that have never not had a digital footprint. So that made me think, because I mean, there's a lot of places you can go with that. And you and I talked about some of this before the show. Like you said, it's not your place to interpose yourself between parents and their children and tell them what they should or should not be teaching their children, or don't use Google or any of that stuff. And I agree. It's not my place. It's not your place to tell people how to raise their kids. But I think those of us who've been paying attention to this can offer, some words of advice, but it really needs to be low level, kind of hands off advice to say, hey, look, here's how I see this. And it's your job to sort it out. It's your job as parents in the 21st century to figure out how we're going to introduce these ideas to our kids. Because, if you go to your 8-year-old son and you just dump all of this on him all at once, have him read Ed Snowden's book and watch Citizen 4, probably not the best approach, right? Like your kid's never going to want to leave his room. You go in there and he's got tinfoil up on the walls, right? That would be the appropriate response from an 8 or 9-year-old. So our job as parents is to kind of inform our children about this like we do about everything else at age-appropriate levels. And so enter Boris the BabyBot. Before I get into what the book is, Murray, where the heck did this idea come from?
So my background is in activism. I'm part of an activist group here in South Africa, which is called the Right to Know campaign, which does a lot of freedom of information and civil liberties work kind of in communities. And part of what we had started to focus on was our own sort of mini issues of state surveillance. So it's not big stuff like what you've got with your NSA and your FBI and all 17 intelligence agencies. But we have problems with the way that the security parts of the state have started to encroach into democratic places, right? And so people who are protesting for basic rights, protesting for better policies and for, often just for their livelihoods, are being treated as national security threats. And so I was part of a small group of activists that started to focus more on this, our little thing of the surveillance state, and figuring out what are they up to? How are they doing this? What are the laws and rules that they apply to themselves, and how can we hold them more accountable? And it's the challenge there, and you're talking about this all the time, is about making these invisible things visible to people, like drawing these secret processes out from the shadow, because you can't get people to engage with a problem until they've seen the problem. And by its nature, this is a secret and invisible problem to most people most of the time. So that was my starting point. And there's lots of reasons why it's a very inspiring work. It's very important work. And it's work that is important to me, but it is also very depressing. And I can often feel like I've been bashing my head against the wall and trying the same things again and again, and trying to convince people who've got a list of 20 things that they desperately care about or worry about, and trying to get this onto that list is very difficult. So a confluence of things happened. And the one is that I burnt out. And the other is that I felt like I needed to try something different, a different approach to starting a conversation about these issues. And I'm not exactly sure how it came to be, but the thought came about. What if you started speaking to children instead of grown-ups about this? What would that look like? And the idea of a children's book that looked at, like, the magic of a children's story applied to one of the most serious and scary and important issues of the day. I don't know what it was, but something about that tickled me. And that was how I came to, start to wonder what a children's book about this would look like. And I came up with the idea of a baby tracking robot called Boris.
Yeah, so Boris the BabyBot is, as you just said, a baby tracking robot. So I'm looking at the very, very first page of the book. It shows a factory and then like a line of words, very, very typical to a baby book or a book for young children. And this is just great the way you did this. Kind of meanders all around the page over to the next page. And it says, Boris the BabyBot is sent from the factory to track all the babies. So this is the idea of surveillance capitalism, the idea that there are companies that, and I addressed this in the very first episode of the show. And if you're listening to this and you've not heard that, that is why surveillance matters, even if you have nothing to hide. So something even as innocuous as your grocery store rewards card is being used to gather all sorts of information, all sorts of data about you, and create a startlingly accurate profile of who you are and what you do, not just your shopping patterns, but where you go in the store, where you go outside the store, because they can tie that to your mobile phone. And so the idea of surveillance capitalism is not anti-capitalist. So a few weeks ago, I had Todd Weaver on from Purism talking about the Librem 5 smartphone. And, Todd decries the evils of surveillance capitalism, but Todd is a capitalist. I'm a capitalist. I believe in the capitalist system, but surveillance capitalism is not opposed to capitalism. Being anti-surveillance capitalism does not mean you're anti-capitalist. It means essentially that you're anti-surveillance. And I think this book does a great job. So going through page after page of this, and it's very well done. I have to say, seriously, Murray, did you do the illustrations?
Yes, I did. I mean, it didn't have to be that way. I just wanted to.
Wow, it's very, very well done. You've got a rare talent, seriously. So when I read through the story, this Boris the BabyBot, his job is to go and collect all of the information he can on babies to create this profile on them. Now, the book does not get into the nitty-gritties of this, right? It doesn't get into the scary side of this at all. Is that correct, Murray?
Yeah, I mean, I was also trying to balance things because on one hand, as I said, I'm trying to come up with a visual language that could introduce kids and their families to the concept of how technology has a life outside of your home. The technology you have in your home is also exchanging information with places out there, companies out there, the company that made that technology. And those exchanges might not always be things that you're particularly happy about if you knew that it was happening. So I was trying to come up with a visual language for this thing that we're calling surveillance capitalism. But at the same time, as important as that is, if you just tell someone, hey, I'm writing a children's book about surveillance capitalism, it sounds a little crazy. And I think more than a few parents would hear that and think, doesn't sound like a book I'd particularly like to give to my kid. That sounds scary. And so finding the balance between looking at these important issues, but also not making it scary, not making it feel like a dangerous topic was quite important to me. So instead of, this device is a lovable-ish looking robot. It's got squiggly arms and like slightly wonky eyes. And it collects information about babies for to make decisions about those babies, about who's a good baby and who's a bad baby. And the good baby gets rewards. I can't remember what it was, like an ice cream or something like that. And the bad baby doesn't get those rewards. And so that we're trying to figure out how these industries would work, how they would make money, how they would make decisions about you that you might not agree with. Yeah, and it's been really interesting to see how people have embraced it. As much as it sounds like a scary topic, I've found so much support for this idea because I think parents are worried about this. It's one of the things about the future that we are raising our kids into that people really worry about. And I think especially in the last few years with, Cambridge Analytica and really seeing the extent to which the technologies that we've invited into our private lives sometimes are just not our friends.
Oh, exactly. No, and one of the things that I really, really, really like about your book is that it's a conversation starter. This is not intended to be like a textbook, like this is going to teach my kid what he needs to know about surveillance or even surveillance capitalism. But it's the idea that here, like you say, this very cute robot. I mean, he's like, I don't know if you've got a toy line out or anything, man, but you ought to think about like, I could actually buy the official Boris the BabyBot. Like that would be pretty awesome. I don't know what the logistics on that would look like, so maybe I never said that. And of course, then you could have like tracking stuff. No, I'm just kidding about that part.
It would take a special kind of capitalist to make all that happen. Yeah,
dude, there's some money to be made here. But he's a very, very funny, enjoyable read. And so the idea is that it starts off with Boris tracking all these babies, but there's this one baby that Boris just can't track, and it's driving him crazy. because that's his job. His job is to track these babies. And so that could be left just at that level right now so that kids just have some vague understanding way in the background somewhere that this is happening. But more than that, the parents that are reading this, would you agree that it's probably going to make them to think maybe a little harder about the technology that they're bringing into their homes and around their children?
Look, that's been my experience. And of course, the kinds of people who reach out to this kind of book are the people who are already having those concerns. But it is interesting, I get messages from parents to say, hey, how do I solve this problem I'm having? Or I'm worried about Google Photos. So I do think that it has worked as a conversation starter, and that's been really interesting and fun. But there's a few reasons why I wanted only to start that conversation. And the first is, you mentioned it earlier, that every household is going to have its own approach to this. There is not a single right way of doing this. In fact, most of the time, we're just trying to choose the least worst option in terms of our technology. And you will often feel like you're losing because you can create a VPN, but there's a software vulnerability over here. Or, you can use encrypted messaging on your cell phone, but your cell phone is constantly pinging a cell phone tower in order to just be a cell phone. So it can often feel like you're failing. And I think being a parent is already the hardest job in the world. And there are already millions of experts out there waiting to tell you why the decisions you're making as a parent are the wrong ones. And I was not keen to join the line on that one. So what I was just trying to do was create, as you said, a platform where parents can start to figure these things out, start to have the conversation, to start making a few choices that they might feel are the right ones for their family. And so as a small concession to that, there's a list of resources that I compiled on the book's website, which is boristhebabybot.org, which just sort of compiled the kind of best in class digital security manuals for the parents, and then, a few conversation items for kids. Like there's, some resources that have been compiled by universities to get kids of a certain age to start to think about their digital footprint. I'm not saying I wrote the book on this, but I can't, it's such a huge issue. I couldn't ever pretend to have the answers to parents, but I'm just saying, look, if you want to start looking for those answers, this is a way to start. Here's a few resources that might get you further down the road. And also just to be compassionate with ourselves, because even the foremost security experts in the world are trying to find the right answers. And most of the time they're coming up short. So be forgiving for when we do fall short, but realizing that every day we're going to try something new to claim a little bit of that privacy for our future.
So this book is available on the internet. So your website is boristhebabybot.org. And can my listeners go there and find this book?
Absolutely. I mean, I will say that shipping has become a slightly complicated thing in the time of a pandemic, as a one-person operation. But yeah, a lot of people have bought the book online. It's available in South African bookstores only, and on Amazon only in the UK. So I've kind of had to navigate, as someone in the global South, had to navigate the sort of maze-like process of trying to sell something across the world when, a lot of these systems are set up to be for people who live in the States, as an example. But despite all of that, it's been really great to see how this book, as I said, could not have existed without the internet and without the people on it.
Oh, no doubt. Your idea was that you're not trying to be the end all be all on here's what you need to do to protect your children from surveillance, but just to get a conversation started. And see, for me, I had to launch a whole podcast to talk about this because it can't be done in 30 minutes or an hour or even 10 hours. I mean, I could write a book on the topic, but by the time that book is in its third printing, it's probably obsolete because this is a moving target. And, all of that can't be fleshed out even, I don't think, in a book. And I probably will eventually write a book about many of the things that I discuss on this show. But the reason I launched a podcast is because I can stay up to the moment. We can talk about what's going on this week or next week or the following week in the surveillance world and you talked earlier about the 17 different intelligence agencies here that I typically just refer to as the alphabet groups, right? Because they're all three letters, NSA, CIA, whatever, till you get into BATFE, but that's, they're the redheaded stepchild of all of this. And they've earned that title. But your book, So the idea here is that children are just reading a fun book. They're just reading a fun book, but it gets them to think about, it plants sort of a seed of something that they can continue to think about age appropriately, and the parents can continue these conversations age appropriately as the kids move on. Would that be correct?
That's true. Exactly right. I mean, the idea was that if I had to choose between sugar and medicine, I would go with the sugar. But I do hope there's a little bit of medicine in there. And so it was an attempt to create a story that could be two things to two different readers. So to some people, it's just a fun story about a robot that can't track babies for some reason. And for others, they can see the bigger story, the bigger metaphor there, and are really energized by it. And, and it's interesting to think, if I had set out to write a different book, if I'd set out to write a book for grown-ups, I don't think I would have ever been able to get people behind that idea. It's like people think that's a good thing, and I'm glad that you're doing that, and God be with you. But what happened with this is I didn't know whether this was an idea that had any cachet. Is that a word?
It is now.
But yeah, I didn't know if this was an idea. I didn't know if this was an idea that people would get behind. And at some point, I just thought, look, let me put it on Indiegogo and see what happens. And I figured I would need about $6,000 US to print this thing. I said, I'll give it a month and see what happens. And within 2 days, I think I was 40% or 50% of the way. And it just like people got behind it in a way I never expected. And it made me realize that there's something about the magic of speaking to children that people really liked about it. Because, hey, it's a scary world, and we all are trying to figure out this problem together.
Absolutely. So, I'll disagree with you on one minor point there. You said, you don't know if you'd written this book for adults, if people would have gotten behind it. I've been super, super happy with how people have gotten behind this podcast. I mean, I'm just a guy. Now, I'm a guy who has spent a decade researching and learning to practice what I think are the best practices for protecting my own privacy, the privacy of my family, things like that. But I am just a guy. And, I came out of nowhere. Like when I launched this podcast February 7th, so 3 months ago, nobody had heard of me. Now we're going up on 4 months now. Okay. I need to keep track of time. Nobody in this space had heard of me. I write for the New American Magazine. I'm a former coordinator for the John Birch Society. I've written some articles for some other publications. But in this space, I was relatively unknown, and I just put it out there and said, hey, guys, I'm going to be doing this podcast. I've been thinking about it for about 3 years. And finally, my wife very wisely said to me, hey, that podcast you keep talking about? I said, yeah. She said, would you either just do that or be quiet about it? Right? So I said, okay, I guess I'll do it. And people have gotten behind it. I mean, I'm beginning to gain some Patreon support. If you're listening to this, you're not supporting yet on Patreon, there'll be a link in the show notes. I'm also going to put a link to Murray's website in the show notes so you can go and find this book. Is it available for download, Murray?
That is a good question. It should be. It should be for ebooks, but I might have to fix that after this interview just to make sure. It is a Creative Commons book, incidentally. So if you have an e-copy, technically you can do whatever you want with it. So, and that was also quite important to me, is I figured if this is a book that everyone agrees is good for everyone and important, it's not just a product. It's an idea that we want to see spreading around the world, is making sure that people could share it without worrying about copyright and stuff like that was important to me.
No, absolutely. For something like this, it would be very difficult to limit that to just something that a person could only buy in a copyrighted and protected form. It was really important, I think, for you to get this out there to where anybody can get their hands on it. If you want a physical copy of it, you're going to have to buy it, but it is available for download and as an ebook. And so, yeah, I'll put a link there along with the Patreon link and a link to my merch store because, so Murray, you're wearing your InfoSec t-shirt. I'm wearing my Enemy of the Surveillance State t-shirt. And if any of the listeners want to get one of those, I'll put a link in the show notes to where you can find that. So, this book, what kind of distribution have you seen? How many copies, physical copies, have you sold? Like the hard copy?
Not a huge number. I would say about 1,000 max, if I had to guess. I printed 2,000 and I printed 2,500 and I've got a stack of them left.
Okay.
And, one of the things that ended up happening is that the international distribution is a very one-man operation. So people are taking it over in suitcases, as the, like just friends and families, they're traveling around, they take it over in suitcases and they ship it
awesome
on their travels, which has been another amazing thing that's happened. But it does mean it's slow to move books. So if anyone wants to put in an order for 500, make me an offer. No, but I'm teasing. Like it's basically, on a more serious note, once the pandemic came and I just realized people got other priorities, including myself. I sort of took this off the back, put this onto the back burner. But I do want to make sure that the book gets out there. And so one of the things that I'd be interested in exploring is if there's any digital rights groups that want this, that want to give this to their members or to communities or to libraries, I'd be happy to make it available to them. And also that, we're talking about capitalism, but honestly, profit is not my primary agenda. It's actually just getting the story out there.
Yeah, it's kind of a strange mix sometimes, though, because like you were talking about the pandemic. So when I first launched this show, I mean, I knew I'm a husband and a father. I'm a writer. I convert alcohol, nicotine, and caffeine into words and sell them for pennies a piece to keep a roof over my family's head. I knew taking on this project this podcast was going to be some time consuming. So I knew I would have to offset that sum. So I did launch the Patreon. I did launch a line of merch. But I very insensitively did it right after the pandemic broke out, right? So I probably looked a little like a jerk there, like, hey, I know you're all locked down at home and figuring out how you're going to pay the rent next month, but hey, throw me $20 on Patreon. I'd really appreciate it. So I've been really careful to say to the people that listen to the show, look, if you're at home because of the pandemic, or you've lost your job because of the pandemic, if your financial situation has changed for the worse because of this, I don't want your support, but I do hope that you'll like and share the show, because the purpose of the show really is to help other people understand the principles that we're discussing. And I like the phrase that I came up with, friends don't let friends get spied on, right? Which, I think it sort of communicates the idea that, like, if I care about you as a person, I need to be sharing information with you, not to be that well actually guy. Nobody likes the well actually guy. The guy, every time you say something, he goes, well, actually, you don't want you to be that guy. But at the same time, if you hear something in an episode that like, oh, Chuck or Jill, they would really they could gain something from hearing this, share the show with them. Share it on Facebook, give it a good review, help spread the message. But if you're in a position to support, I do want people to support. So like for you, I mean, I know maybe profit off of your book was not the end all be all, but if somebody offered you, $20 for a copy of the book, you'd sell it to them. And then you turn that $20 into something else that you could use to push this message further forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is something where it's a good point, because because this is a passion project, I've often had to be reminded by supporters, by people who back the crowdfunding campaign, that there is value to this, that, and people are saying, hey, look, we want to support the value that we see in this project. And I definitely think, with just going to an earlier point you made, is that it's really important, as an example, your podcast, that we always find the balance between saying, okay, these are tough times, and you would never ask someone who's going through a tough time to kind of make a financially difficult decision for themselves, but finding the balance between making sure that people are part of these discussions, and also that, that the artists shouldn't starve. Like the work that goes into producing a discussion like this has value.
Yeah, there is value in this. And part of the proof of concept for you was that 250 people pulled out their credit cards and supported your book. Part of the proof of concept for me is that I have a growing number of patrons, and I have sold some merchandise. People want to support things that they believe in. You just have to give them something that really does have value. I think your book has tremendous value. I can see a place for this book in libraries, public libraries, where people can check this out and bring it home to their children. I can see this wrapped up with a pretty wrapping paper and a nice little bow for someone's second birthday or something like that. I mean, it's a well done book. Now, I've never held a physical copy of it because I live in the United States, and I can't just walk down to Barnes and Noble or Books 1,000 or whatever and buy one of these. I live in a small town, so it's Books 1,000, where everybody else has Books 1,000,000. But so, I can't do that. But the copy that you sent me to preview before this episode of the show, I'm looking at it, and it's very well done. I can see this on, heavy card stock is probably the way it's printed. And man, it's a good looking book. It's got real value. It's cleverly written. It's cutely, if that's a word, cutely illustrated. And I can see children just enjoying the colors and the feel and the look of this book and taking in sort of this fun message that, as you say, could be very, very dark, but you manage somehow to keep it light, you keep it fun. And I think it's a great educational tool, and there's a lot of value in what you've done here. And I hope there'll be more of this. I hope there's going to be a sequel or something like that. I could see I could see people taking this conversation and going with it. And I'm really, really impressed by what you've done here, Murray.
Well, I don't know if people can hear blushing over a podcast, but that's very kind. Thank you.
Well,
the question of shifting to these companies, what do you call the incestuous, what was it? The incestuous relationship?
The incestuous relationship between like Google and Facebook and what have you, and say the NSA, CIA, FBI. So,
well, I thought maybe, to talk a little bit about how I got onto the companies themselves, right? And so the first is obviously for most people, they're more worried, like their interactions with surveillance technology is often with a consumer product primarily. They're not thinking about the NSA or the Five Eyes. They're thinking about Facebook or Google or Apple or Amazon or whatever.
Exactly.
But an interesting thing from an international perspective is that, the NSA and GCHQ spy on me because even though I'm here down in South Africa, I'm not of any interest to them that I know of, but I do have digital communication that's going across these kind of global, sort of going down the pipes of the internet, pipes and tubes, and they're siphoning all of that stuff that they can, irrespective of, whether I am in a terrorist group or a guy in a hoodie sitting in his, in his back study. But what's interesting is outside of the kind of global north, Europe, UK, the US, a lot of us live in countries where actually the states are not as powerful as international corporations. Now you can look at the states, and I'm sure if you're someone who follows the regulatory processes around big tech, it sometimes feels like the US government is not more powerful than the tech companies. But if you go into most parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America, the technology companies are probably more powerful than those national governments and their intelligence agencies. So for me, coming from someone who was very focused on my state and its surveillance practices, shifting to the private sector, to the global private sector, became important because I suddenly realized like I was focusing on the small fry guys. And as you said, there's an incestuous relationship no matter where you are. Or in some cases, like Google and China, there's there's an unhappy alliance there. But definitely these companies and their states are interacting all the time. But from a global perspective, you realize that a lot of these companies are more powerful than any state structure. And they can't get voted out of power, right? You can vote with
because
your
we keep voting. Well, we keep voting for them with our pocketbooks. We stand in line to buy the newest device. We go and work all week to have enough money to go and buy the device that we're going to install in our homes or carry on our bodies to allow them to spy on us. It's like we've out 1984'd 1984. Big Brother's not forcing these devices into us, into our homes. We go out and buy them. And again, all of that, I'm not anti-tech. I'm just anti-tech surveillance. Just like I'm not anti-police, I'm just anti-police state. I'm anti-surveillance state. The name of the show is, after all, Enemy of the Surveillance State. So, no, you make an interesting point there, though, that in a lot of these ways, these companies are more powerful than the states. I don't think that's probably true here in the U.S. Our state is way too powerful, given the construct of our Constitution that is supposed to have limited it way shorter than where we find it now. But part of it is that, like, we look at something like the PRISM project, the program that Ed Snowden revealed with all of his NSA leaks to the journalists. Key players for PRISM: Google, Microsoft, Apple. So like you're carrying around that iPhone because you're like, oh, it's at least I'm not using Google. Well, okay. But Apple was in bed and is probably still in bed with the NSA and helping to harvest your data. And sure, Apple took this big stand in a couple of years ago in the FBI versus Apple case over Saeed Farouk's phone. And I think Apple was on the right side of that issue. I don't take exception with them there. Just to say all of a sudden it was in their best interests to protect their product, and they sold it to the American people in terms of protecting my privacy. But they'd already shown by their participation in PRISM that my privacy is certainly not their biggest priority.
Sure. And, but it's interesting when you think about it I think what you're saying is right, is that often as individual consumers, we're making a choice, right? So being on Facebook often is a very, very, it's an easily avoidable problem. Not always. For example, if you live in certain parts of the developing world, being on Facebook is sometimes the only way that you get access to the internet, because of like Facebook's basic program. So it's, like if you live in a pretty rundown part of the world, sometimes if you want to get connected to society at all, you have to use these products. But in other cases, people have less choice. So e-learning, as an example, like Microsoft and Google are the big kind of international players on providing digital learning tools to government education programs. Now, you can vote out the government for putting Microsoft and Google software into your schools without your consent, but it would be, like on the hierarchy of needs, probably that's not the biggest thing you're worried about. You're worried about running water, decent highways, medical system, jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But what's kind of interesting is that when a lot of these companies realize that maybe they're in the developed world, their customers have become a lot more standoffish, which is kind of what seems to have happened with Facebook. That North Americans are much less comfortable on Facebook now than they were much less comfortable now than they were in 2016. So these guys think, we'll shift to a new marketplace. We'll go make deals with those governments, not with their citizens, but with those governments. Or we'll go find poorer users in the third world, and we'll give them something that feels like it's for free.
And that's what I mean by the incestuous relationship. So we've got, they're not making deals, like you say, with the citizens. They're making deals with the governments of those systems. And there's something in it for the governments of those systems. So like for me, and you're right, Facebook is probably one of the most easily avoided things. I had avoided Facebook for years, burned everything to the ground. First, I downloaded all of my stuff, right, which took forever and a half because I'd been using Facebook for years by that point. But I finally got to the point right after the Cambridge Analytica thing, because I'd been writing about this kind of stuff for years, but I was still on Facebook. And I finally just had to stop and ask myself the real pertinent question, sort of the pivotal question. How can I continue now in the face of this evidence? How can I, Mitchell Shaw, continue to have a relationship with a company whose sole job is to harvest my data and use it to manipulate me, use it to manipulate elections or whatever else, right? So I got all my stuff off. I deleted my account, burned everything to the ground, walked away, was never going to look back. And then I launched a podcast about surveillance, right? So then I was like, gosh, I don't want to be that guy that launches a podcast that I think, by the way, is great. But of course I make it. So of course I think that, right? I don't want to be the guy that launches that podcast and then 0 people listen to it because 0 people know about it. Like my closest friends or what have you, they're going to listen to it, but they get to hear this over beers on Saturday, when we're grilling chicken or whatever. So, why have a podcast if no one's going to listen to it? So, I had to brainstorm about, man, how am I going to get this message out? And I kept coming back to Facebook and going, darn it, I just don't want to do that. So I had to, and I've been real open on Facebook with the fact that I am approaching the day, I don't know when it will be, when again I get to burn it to the ground. When this show has enough listeners that it's beginning to grow under its own steam, and I don't have to be at the keyboard all the time reminding people to download an episode or, hey, just posted a new episode. When I've got enough subscribers that are doing that work for me, at the water cooler at work and at the dinner table and when they're hanging out with friends, when they're doing that for me, I look forward to the day that I get to publicly burn my Facebook account again, and this time never look back. Now, having said that, I take extreme cautions. I've only got one browser that I will open Facebook in. I've got that browser locked down tight as a drum. I do everything out over a VPN. I'm taking the steps that I can take, but I don't fool myself into thinking those steps are 100%.
Yeah, so. But I mean, I think that's the kind of everyone is having to make those difficult choices. And that's another reason why having a compassionate approach to this, to say, these are your options, these are the limitations of each of these options, and none of them is perfect, is so important, because one of the things that can happen in focusing on surveillance activism is that it can feel like losing is the only option. And
Right.
that creates a fatalism, which ultimately is so defeating, because instead, when people don't know which of the worst options to choose, sometimes they just do nothing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, there's the old adage, when in question, when in doubt, run in circles, scream and shout, right? Like, I'm not going to make a decision. I'm just lost over here. Woe is us. But there are decisions they can make. And like you say, sometimes perhaps choosing the least worst option is your best option, at least in the short term. The purpose of this show is to get people thinking about this topic and to propose what I have found to be the best solutions. Now, there's a couple of schools of thought in this space, in the space of advising people about this kind of thing. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, for example, tremendous respect for them. I love what they're doing to combat this type of thing. I don't agree with them on everything, but on this, I agree with them 100%. Their approach is never, ever recommend a particular product, because you don't know that product might change in the future. You don't know that there's not already a better product. I don't take that school of thought. There are things that I have used and I've looked at very closely, that I've talked to people who understand it better than I do, that have said, no, this is a solid tool. Like, for instance, for me, if Ed Snowden is comfortable using the Signal app, and it's an open source project that anyone can verify that it does exactly what they say it does, I am comfortable using Signal for my texts, and I recommend Signal. I recommend Proton Mail. I recommend Proton VPN. I'm not compensated for that in any way at all. I made the decision early on in this show to be listener supported, not ad supported, because if I tell somebody that I trust a particular product, I want them to know that it's because I actually trust it, not because I just cashed a check from the guy that makes that product. So, I do recommend, and I'm glad to know that in the prologue or epilogue of your book, you recommend sort of, continued sources. Like, here's some places you can go to look at maybe some best practices. Do you recommend anything in particular, or is it just really sort of a low-level general idea?
That's an interesting question. I mean, actually, you mentioned the EFF. If you go to the resources on the website, one of the places I send the grown-ups to say, okay, here's some stuff for your kids. The EFF Surveillance Self-Defense Guide is one of the best starting points that I've come across.
It really is.
And
in fact, I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes for the listeners.
And one of the approaches that they take, as you know, is that they don't recommend anything. They just say, take this, do a threat assessment of yourself. What am I trying to protect? Against whom? What are their capabilities? What are the consequences if I fail? And how much inconvenience, or how much am I willing to change in order to accomplish all these goals? And the answer for me is going to be different to the answer for you, or for most listeners, for most parents and their kids. So for example, I use the Signal app, but I know that for a lot of, I also have WhatsApp for all of its problems, because in South Africa, most people are on WhatsApp. And for example, for community organizers to say, hey, everyone, migrate away from where the whole community is and use Signal, which does have a few technical hitches on it as well. There is a cost and a benefit to every single product or platform or software. Signal is the one where I can say, the pros are pretty clear. There's very little room for failure. And if you get stuck, you can always switch over to something else temporarily.
Exactly.
I also
because I have had times.
Incidentally.
I've had times with Signal where a server goes down, or I get a borked update or whatever. It just happened to my wife. We're driving back from visiting some family over the weekend, and she had let her Signal app expire, so I had to upgrade to the newest one, which meant because her phone sucks, I had to delete a whole bunch of stuff just to make room for this update. Then I get the update, and Signal kept crashing. I had to go in and wipe the cache and get it back up and running, and it was fine. I was able to do that, but I did think just in that moment, gosh, another user right now would have to switch to another app while they uninstalled this and reinstalled it, because you're out of comms. You're not going to get texts. If this is on Android, you can make that your only text app. iPhone, it acts as a supplementary app. But for Android, you can make it, and we have made it our only text app. So when it goes down for us, we're just out of comms. And it's inconvenient, particularly if, you're out somewhere and really need to get in touch with somebody, or, hey, I just went into labor, or, I hope that would be a phone call. But who knows, man, who knows? I know a woman who, while in labor, had the laptop open on her belly, updating Facebook while she was in active labor. So, somebody might text, honey, I need you to come home. I'm in labor. It could happen. It shouldn't, but it could. So yeah, but I get you that you have to do this cost benefits analysis. You have to ask yourself, how much trouble am I willing to go through? And my answer, because I've spent so much time looking at this and it's so important to me, will be different than your answer. It will not be the same answer you come up with. But for me, it really comes down to like, okay, first, what are the immediate things that we have to do? Like, I would go so far as to say, if you've got an Amazon Echo in your house, if you can say, hey, Alexa, and anything in your house answers you, you need to get rid of that, because that thing is always listening. It is always spying on you. And when we talk about the incestuous relationship between the surveillance state and these companies, you have to realize that your security chain, your privacy chain, is only as strong as its weakest link. If I'm with the NSA, and this is in Ed Snowden's book, right? So if I'm with the NSA and I'm trying to surveil you, I don't have to install anything. I just need to figure out whether you've already got something I can get into. And it's not just the NSA. It's back to your book and sort of the premise of your book. If I wanted Google to know everything going on in my life, if I wanted Google reading my emails, I would have copied them on those emails. If I wanted Google to see what's going on with my webcam right now, I would have invited them into this Jitsi call. So, it really comes down ultimately to, do I own the right? Do I own the data about me? And my answer is yes, I own that. If I can't say yes to that, then I am not a free man.
Yeah, I mean, it takes us, I think, for most ordinary civilians, if you want, this conversation can become quite grim quite quickly.
Sure.
And it can, as I said, it can create this sense of fatalism, of paralysis, of dread. And
absolutely,
that's why finding ways to talk about this that are fun, and whether it's a children's book, it's like a conversational podcast, it's satire, these different things. These are such an important toolbook to creating societal change, to changing people's minds. Because what I was really realizing as an activist is screaming at people, not necessarily literally, but not always not literally, screaming into people's faces about the end of the world wasn't winning over that many new people. A lot of people agree, but they can't put it on the top 10 list of things that they're worried about. And a lot of people just think,
dude, you're
going
crazy.
back to the first question in your podcast, why should I worry? I don't have anything to hide.
Exactly. Because, when it comes down to it, I like to say, and this is a perfect opportunity. I don't know if I've ever said this on this show, on this podcast, but there is a difference between eye contact and a piercing maniacal stare. And if you sound crazy, it doesn't even matter if you're right. You just sound crazy. And somebody does not walk away from that conversation thinking, oh, I'm so glad I had that conversation with that very informed and articulate gentleman. They walk away going, dang, I finally met one, right? Like they call their wife and they're like, I just met a guy that is bat crap crazy. This guy is off his nut.
I think I've been relatively blessed, but I did meet at least one or two people in the conceptual phases of Boris the BabyBot who walked away thinking that they just had that encounter. Like back before there was a book to show someone, when I said, hey, I'm working on this book about capitalism and surveillance, and, there's a robot and it's going to track babies and I'm drawing it myself. People just, like, there's just one or two people who went, oh, and that was pretty much the end of the conversation.
Would you look at that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I fortunately, I'm 49 years old, so I've had some time in my life to sort of simmer down a little bit, because I am a bit of a firebrand. Speaking to my priest once, I used the expression, I'll burn that bridge when I come to it. And he said, oh, Mitch, I think you mean you'll cross that bridge. And I said, no, Father, I'll burn that bridge when I come to it. I said exactly what I meant. But I have simmered down some. I've gotten to a place where I realized that, like you said about your book, if you had to choose between sugar and medicine, you chose sugar. And for what it's worth, I think your book is, so I'll use the sugar analogy, and I'll say your book is very sweet, but there's a good dose of medicine in there too. I think that your book does a great job of at least sparking a thought that maybe someone would not have had. And like you say, the downside of this is the likelihood that somebody, from my perspective, for my podcast, the likelihood that someone's just going to stumble across my podcast with my very ominous logo and a title like Enemy of the Surveillance State and be, oh, I wonder what this is about, and listen to it with no idea where it's going, and then be like, oh, that guy changed my mind. Probably not great. By the same token, people aren't going to go looking for a book. Somebody who doesn't already share our idea of the evils of a surveillance state is not likely going to go looking for a book about surveillance to give their toddler. It's probably not going to happen, but somebody's over at one of those people's houses and sees the book on the shelf and pulls it off and looks at it, or somebody buys this book and gives it to a niece or a nephew for their birthday or something like that. And your book is not, there's no, even when I go back and I look, like, the darkest page on your book, the darkest page on your book is the factory makes money by deciding who's a good baby and who's a bad baby. But even the evil people in this don't look evil. They're very cartoonish. It's very, they're clearly not nice people, but they're not scary at all. There's nothing in this book that a child is going to throw this book across the room and hide under his bed over. It's very well done.
Thank you very much. One of the most amazing things is seeing how, I don't have kids myself yet. It's going to change pretty soon. But seeing how kids, there's a few kids that have really taken to this. And I get messages from parents that are just like, oh, we're reading this for the 30th time. And I feel so bad for the parents, but I feel so good for myself. We've read this every night for the last 5 weeks or whatever like that. And one of my proudest little moments is someone sent me a message to say that her two kids, maybe 5 and 8, have a song that they've made about this book that they sing every day. And she says, I would love to send you a video of it, but they won't let me film because they've taken the message. And I thought,
oh my gosh.
Oh man, good kids.
That is kids. Awesome. Now, what mom and dad could do is film that on the sly, but then if the kids ever find out, you break down trust and now it's gone, those kids are going to pack their stuff and leave. Man, that's a great story. Oh man. Well, listen, it has been just truly, truly great having you on the show, man. I look forward to seeing what your book does in the future. So if somebody in the U.S. wants to get a hard copy of your book, they can go to the website, they can order it. They're just going to have to wait for it to arrive.
Yeah. So what I will say is that everyone can order it. I'd be happy to send it to you. I'll be in touch, but things have become unpredictable with the pandemic. So that's what I can say. But if it doesn't work out, you're welcome to reach out to me.
Well, man, God bless you. Thanks for being on the show, and just keep doing what you do, okay?
And thank you very much for having me. These are important discussions, man.
Absolutely. So for my listeners, again, be sure to like and share this. Give it a 5-star review on whatever episode or whatever platform where you listen to podcasts. Check out the links in the show notes for how to support us on Patreon or pick up any merch. Check out the show notes. I'm going to put that link to the EFF's guide in there. A link for Murray's website so you can pick up a copy of Boris the BabyBot, whether a physical copy or an ebook, whatever you want to do. And until next week, this has been Mitchell Shaw and Murray, I knew your last name. Wow, Murray Hunter on Enemy of the Surveillance State. We'll see you next week.